Okay, our next speaker is Faith McDonnell. She's the director of the Religious Liberty Program at the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C. Faith works to inform and to motivate American church members about the persecution of Christians around the world. Faith directs the Church Alliance for a New Sudan to mobilize churches for advocacy and action against the Sudanese genocide. Faith has co-authored the book Girl Soldier, A Story of Hope for Northern Uganda's Children, published in 2007. She's published in National Review, American Spectator, Front Page Magazine, the New Sudan Christian newspaper, and Christianity Today. She attended Eastern Nazarene College in Massachusetts and received her master's degree in English from the University of Maryland. It's my pleasure to introduce you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Ashraf, for inviting me to be with you today, and thank you all who have soldiered out here in the snow. And I need to start by saying you'll have to excuse my appearance and also the fact that I'm going to be leaving pretty soon. But before I even knew about the conference, I was scheduled to participate in a demonstration at the White House with the Sudanese from Nuba Mountains. So I'll be leaving after this. Well, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about lessons from 14 years of advocacy. I've been at the IRD, Institute on Religion and Democracy, since 1990. What is it? My daughter was born in 1993, but we really didn't get moving on advocacy till about 1996. So this is 14 years, but it will just be brief highlights, I assure you. What did advocacy for religious freedom issues look like 14 years ago and beyond? This might give us some encouragement in spite of knowing the seriousness of what we face. But beyond 1996, when I started working for the persecuted church, we were writing letters, longhand, to members of Congress, to prison camp officials, and doctors at psychiatric hospitals with a return receipt request so we would know that they actually got there, and asking for the release of prisoners, of Jewish dissidents, of Christian prisoners, of people who were put in mental hospitals because of their faith. I can remember, because of the snow, going to conferences held by Dr. Ernest Gordon from Princeton, the chaplain of Princeton, in his group called CREED, the Christian Rescue Effort for the Emancipation of Dissidents. I thought that was an awesome title. And we would get together and sign Christmas cards to Christian prisoners and then mail them off together. There was no formal place for religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy at that time. It was a case-by-case basis with any congressman who happened to care enough. And mostly it's the same ones who care now. People like Frank Wolf and Sam Brownback, Chris Smith, people like that, the late Tom Lantos. We had obstacles from the State Department. Well, that hasn't changed any. Where did you go to be an advocate for people who were being persecuted? The United Nations? I don't think so. There was almost no mention of these issues in the media, and there was no sophisticated technology, no social networking, internet. We thought it was a big deal to send a fax. And there was a large population that was ignorant of persecution, and others were only informed about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. That was my story for quite a long time. Not much awareness of Islam, regardless of what was happening in the Middle East and beyond. The things that were happening in the early 90s in Sudan that nobody really knew about at that time. Now we have positives. We have technological advances, and you know them all: email, internet, Facebook. We have the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, which started in 1996. We have a State Department office on religious freedom, and by the way, that was actually created as a way of trying to circumvent the International Religious Freedom Act that was being trying to pass in Congress. The Clinton administration said, see, we just started an office on religious freedom. You don't need this other legislation. But we did indeed get the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, and that means that now the issue of religious freedom is a formal part of U.S. foreign policy, whether they like it or not. It's enshrined in U.S. foreign policy. We also have, as a result of that act, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and the monitoring that that group does. We have more hearings with benchmarks to evaluate things. We have a growing awareness of global jihad and Islamic insurgents, and we have an alternative media, thanks to people like Pamela, that is savvy and activist. On the negative side, we have the massive growth of Islamism around the world. We have growing anti-Semitism and a blame Israel for everything attitude. We have the inability of much of the public, the media, and government officials to make associations, to connect the dots. You know, they may see something and talk about it as a human rights issue, but they never seem to be able to connect the dots on things. We have insanity on the part of world governments in general, but especially when it comes to this issue in terms of the things Pamela was speaking about the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, you know, and I keep thinking of Melanie Phillips' new book, The World Turned Upside Down. And we're living in a world that's upside down. We have growing isolationist tendencies by some angry Americans who see their money slipping away and don't want to be involved in any of these issues. I just wrote an article for Pajamas Media, and I was appalled by some of the comments from conservatives talking about, we shouldn't be involved in Sudan. That's their battle. Let them fight it out. Or, you know, and I wasn't asking for funds. I wasn't asking for boots on the ground. I was just saying we need to make a moral stand on this issue. But people are very skittish, and we need to work on that. And finally, we have appeasement and denial by many churches, both mainline and increasingly evangelical churches. So what lessons can help us to be more successful advocates in light of those negatives, but also the positives, for true human rights in the Middle East and against radical Islam now? Well, first lesson that I learned is that churches may help or they may hinder advocacy for human rights in the Middle East. The same churches that were silent about persecution in the Soviet Union, you know, you had the World Council of Churches sitting side by side with supposedly representatives of the church in Russia who actually turned out to be KGB agents. So you had them silent about that persecution, and they're silent about persecution under Islam today. Or if they're not silent, they're partnering. You know, when the Ground Zero Mosque, we saw this just cadre of supporters for Daisy and Raouf from churches scolding people for standing against the mosque, you know, and saying you're not being Christian at all. Richard Cizik, the former National Association of Evangelicals vice president here in town, saying shame, shame, shame to Christians who stand against this. And just appalling the way that the churches are being appeasers. When forced to confront the persecution, for instance, I used to be a member of the Episcopal Church, and when we brought a resolution on Sudan to the Episcopal Church's General Convention, it had an unfortunate clause in the resolution that said the forced Islamization taking place in the Nuba Mountains. Well, that got their knickers in a twist, you know. Forced Islamization, are you saying Islam is a bad thing? We said, no, we're saying forced is a bad thing. But they, you know, we had to change that phrase in order to get anywhere with this resolution to precarious state of human rights in the Nuba Mountains. This is when that tens of thousands of people were being killed in the Nuba Mountains. So that was a precarious state of human rights. But later, when the Episcopal Church actually met bishops and others from Sudan, and they told them point blank, this is what's happening to us, and it's the Islamists who are doing it to us, then they were forced to admit it, but they also give moral equivalence to the persecutors as well as the persecuted. And they blame the U.S. or Israel. You know, they find a way always to blame us together for things. Or like the Save Darfur campaign and all of its affiliates did at the beginning, they raise awareness of a genocide without attaching blame. You know, there's a genocide taking place. It just spontaneously combusted, you know. But they never mention who the perpetrators of the genocide are. That has changed with Save Darfur, I'm happy to say, and they seem to have learned a few lessons. An example of how churches can help is this, I talked about 1996, the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. This was the first massive effort to get churches to pray, and hopefully also by praying, God, you know, putting the thumb on them and saying, do something as well for the persecuted around the world. And what was really remarkable about that event, and still is that it's observed by people all over the world. So people who are being persecuted are praying for other people who are being persecuted. Another way, I have a lot more ways about how churches hinder advocacy than I do how they help it, but with International Religious Freedom Act, we had so much opposition from churches on that piece of legislation. You know, the National Council of Churches and their cohorts lined up in opposition. They had a dog and pony show in Congress where they brought representatives supposedly of all these churches that we were talking about in countries where they're being persecuted to say, no, everything's fine, we're not being persecuted. And if you talk about it, it's going to be really bad for us. You know, so not even seeing the lack of logic in their own statements, but using that to try to stop the bill. In fact, it was really funny because Mother Jones magazine, if you're familiar with that, that's a pretty leftist magazine, they did an article criticizing churches for joining with big business to try to stop the bill to improve religious freedom around the world. So I still have that article somewhere. But then, you know, my dear friend, Congressman Frank Wolf, one of his favorite statements was, there are more churches than chambers of commerce in the United States. Basically to say, if we can get the churches motivated, then we can, you know, overcome these oppositions from big business and from places like that. We just have to find the churches that understand and build relationships with them, and especially with those that are neutral or clueless, to build new relationships with them.